History is not just the story of what happened. It is also the story of what was hidden, what was buried, and what was deliberately erased. In the sprawling, gaslit cities of the 19th century, an era that gave birth to the modern police force, a darker narrative was being written in the shadows. This is the story of crimes not merely unsolved, but actively concealed by the very men who wore the badge. These are the forgotten crimes, where the line between lawman and lawbreaker blurred into non-existence, and justice was a commodity for sale to the highest bidder, leaving behind a legacy of silent victims and unanswered questions that echo to this day.
To understand the cover-up, you must first understand the system that bred it. The 19th century was a crucible of change. Cities like New York, London, and New Orleans swelled beyond recognition, packed with a combustible mix of immense wealth and desperate poverty. Into this chaos stepped a new figure, the professional police officer. But this was not the dawn of a golden age of justice. It was the birth of an institution deeply enmeshed in the grimy machinery of local politics. In cities across America, and particularly in New York, the police department was not an arm of the law so much as it was the muscle of the dominant political machine. An officer's job, his beat, his very career, often depended not on his merit but on the patronage of a local politician or ward boss. Loyalty was not to a code of ethics or to the public good. It was to the party that signed your paycheck. This system created an environment where corruption wasn't just possible, it was expected. It was the very air the institution breathed. Police became instrumental in everything from rigging elections to protecting illegal gambling dens and brothels. A weekly payment to the precinct captain ensured that certain illicit businesses could operate without fear of a raid. The police weren't fighting the city's vice economy. In many cases, they were managing it for their own profit. This culture of graft and political servitude was the fertile ground in which the seeds of the cover-up could grow. If an officer could be paid to ignore a gambling den, he could certainly be paid to ignore a brawl, an assault, or even a murder. If a politician needed a problem to disappear, the police were the ones to sweep it under the rug. Evidence could be lost, witnesses could be intimidated into silence, and official reports could be masterpieces of fiction. Across the Atlantic, the situation was different in structure, but often similar in outcome. While London's Metropolitan Police prided itself on a more professional image, the dark side of Victorian policing was a grim reality. A rigid internal culture, a fierce sense of brotherhood, and a desire to protect the force's reputation at all costs meant that crimes committed by officers were often handled with a conspiracy of silence. An officer's word was sacrosanct against a civilian's, especially if that civilian was poor, an immigrant, or a dissident. This created a dangerous imbalance of power, where an act of brutality on a dimly lit street could be officially recorded as resisting arrest or a justifiable use of force, with no one to contradict the report. Historical analysis of police ledgers from this era paints a damning picture. A study of records from London between 1850 and 1870 revealed a staggering disparity. For the average citizen, the chance of having charges dropped was less than 10%. But for individuals with known connections to powerful politicians or prominent businessmen, that number skyrocketed. Charges against the well-connected were dropped in over 60% of cases. This isn't just a statistic, it's a mathematical portrait of a two-tier justice system. This was the anatomy of the 19th century cover-up, a foundation of political patronage, a structure of systemic bribery, and a culture of unquestioning loyalty to the brotherhood, all built on a society deeply divided by class, race, and power. It was a system perfectly designed not to solve crimes, but to manage them, and, when necessary, to make them disappear entirely. In this world, the truth was a liability. A badge was not always a symbol of protection, but often a license for predation. The real crime was not the act of violence itself, but getting caught. And the entire machinery of law enforcement was often geared towards preventing that from happening.
especially when the perpetrator was one of their own or one of their patrons. The very nature of a successful cover-up means that the full scope of this corruption is lost to time. For every case we can piece together from a deathbed confession or a rediscovered journal, there are likely thousands that remain buried in the archives, their truths silenced forever. But the cases that have surfaced offer a chilling glimpse into this shadow world, where justice was not blind, but wore a blindfold that could be bought and sold. It was a system where a man's life could be worth less than a politician's favor, and a woman's murder less important than a wealthy family's reputation. The forgotten crimes of this era are not just historical curiosities. They are the foundational stories of a struggle for accountability that continues to this day. Nowhere was this corrupt symbiosis between politics and policing more pronounced than in New York City. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, the city was in the grip of Tammany Hall, a political machine so powerful and so deeply corrupt that its influence touched every aspect of civic life, from the mayor's office down to the cop on the beat. The New York City Police Department was, for all intents and purposes, the armed wing of Tammany Hall. Captains and commissioners were appointed based on their loyalty and their ability to deliver votes and kickbacks. The force was a tool for enforcing the machine's will and enriching its members. It is within this cesspool of institutional decay that we find one of the most chilling and illustrative cases of a police cover-up, the murders attributed to the so-called Bowery Strangler in 1874. The Bowery district was the city's beating, bleeding heart of poverty, a place of crowded tenements, cheap gin mills, and factories that churned through human labor with brutal indifference. It was here, in the spring and summer of 1874, that a series of women were found murdered, all of them young, impoverished factory workers, their lives extinguished with a cold, methodical violence. The city was gripped by fear. The press sensationalized the killings, creating the specter of a monster stalking the city's most vulnerable. The pressure on the NYPD was immense. They needed a culprit, and they needed one fast. They found their man in Thomas Kearney, a down-and-out transient with a history of petty crime. The case against him was, from the start, suspiciously neat. Evidence seemed to materialize out of thin air. Witnesses, themselves residents of the precarious world of the Bowery, came forward with testimonies that fit the police's narrative perfectly. The trial was a whirlwind, and Kearney, bewildered and unable to mount a credible defense, was swiftly convicted and sent to the gallows. To the public, it was a satisfying conclusion. The monster was caught, justice was served, and the women of the Bowery could breathe easier. The NYPD celebrated a major victory, a testament to their efficiency and dedication. The case was closed, the file archived, and the name Thomas Kearney became a footnote in the city's bloody history. But the real story, the one that festered in the shadows for decades, was far more sinister. It wouldn't begin to surface until years later, with the discovery of the private journals of a retired police captain, a man who had been a young detective during the time of the Bowery killings. In his journals, written in a cramped, unsteady hand, the old captain unburdened his conscience. He laid bare a conspiracy that reached into the highest echelons of New York's industrial and political elite. The man he and his colleagues believed was the real killer, he wrote, was not Thomas Kearney at all. He was the son of a powerful industrialist, a man whose factories employed thousands, whose wealth was immeasurable, and whose financial contributions kept the Tammany Hall machine running smoothly. This young man was known in elite circles for his depraved appetites and his volatile, violent temper. But his father's name and fortune made him untouchable. The captain's journal detailed with chilling precision how the cover-up was orchestrated. The primary suspect, the industrialist's son, was briefly and privately questioned, then quietly released. The investigation was then steered with deliberate intent toward a convenient scapegoat.
Detectives on the industrialist's private payroll, men who held NYPD badges but served a different master, were tasked with manufacturing the case against Kearney. The journal described how a piece of jewelry belonging to one of the victims was planted in Kearney's meager belongings. It spoke of how key witnesses were paid, threatened, and coerced into providing false testimony, their words scripted by the very men supposed to be seeking the truth. Thomas Kearney wasn't a monster. He was a sacrifice. His life was traded to protect a powerful family's reputation and to preserve the lucrative relationship between the industrialist and the political machine. The police didn't solve the crime. They framed an innocent man to cover for a guilty one, and in doing so, they became accomplices to murder. The Bowery Strangler case is a microcosm of the era's corruption. It demonstrates how the levers of justice could be pulled by money and power, transforming a police investigation into a piece of theater designed to placate the public while the real villain remained safe in the wings. The full, horrifying extent of this systemic rot in New York would not be exposed to the public until 2 decades later, with the Glasgow Committee investigation of 1894. This legislative inquiry peeled back the facade of the NYPD, revealing a deeply entrenched system of bribery, extortion, and abuse that shocked the nation. The testimony was stunning. Officers spoke of a tariff system for vice, where brothels, gambling dens, and illegal saloons paid a fixed monthly price to the police to operate. Promotions within the force were not earned, but bought, with the price for a captaincy running into the thousands of dollars, an investment that was quickly recouped through graft. Witnesses told stories of false arrests, of evidence being planted, and of citizens being shaken down by the very people meant to protect them. The committee uncovered a world where police captains were not just lawmen, but criminal entrepreneurs, managing the city's underworld for their own enrichment. And amidst the tales of financial corruption were darker, more personal horrors that had been swept under the rug. The committee's records contain the case of a police officer who, in 1891, was convicted of raping a 14-year-old boy. His punishment, handed down internally by a department more concerned with its image than with justice, was not prison. It was not even dismissal. His punishment was the loss of just 3 days' pay. A child's life was shattered, and the institution deemed it an offense worth less than a long weekend. While the Glasgow Committee brought much to light, its findings only hinted at the true number of individual crimes, assaults, robberies, and murders that were deliberately obscured as part of this widespread culture of corruption. For every story told, countless others remained buried with their victims. The case of the Bowery Strangler was not an anomaly. It was business as usual in a city where justice was a commodity and a badge was a license to commit crime, not to solve it. Let us travel south, from the cold, grimy streets of New York to the humid, volatile atmosphere of New Orleans. In the 19th century, this was a city unlike any other in America. A melting pot of cultures, a port bustling with commerce, and a place where the lines of race and class were drawn with a particular and often violent rigidity. Here, the mechanisms of police corruption were intertwined not only with political power, but also with the brutal enforcement of a racial hierarchy. The law was a tool to maintain the existing social order, and justice was a concept that rarely crossed the color line. Nowhere was this more evident than in the case of the Elysian Fields killing of 1881. The victim was a man named Jacques Dubois. Dubois was a rarity in the post-Reconstruction South, a successful, ambitious, mixed-race businessman. He was a savvy landowner, acquiring properties and building a portfolio that was beginning to rival those of established white merchants. His success was a quiet act of defiance against a system designed to keep him down. And for that, he became a target. His growing influence was seen as a threat by his white business rivals, who watched his ascent with a mixture of envy and racial animosity. In the tense climate of New Orleans, his ambition was a dangerous thing to possess.
On a sweltering evening in 1881, Jacques Dubois' body was found. The evidence at the scene left no doubt. This was a clear and brutal murder. He had been attacked, beaten, and left for dead. The motive, to anyone who understood the city's undercurrents, seemed obvious. This was not a random act of violence.
But the official investigation, conducted by the New Orleans Police Department, would tell a very different story. The department was under immense pressure from the very same white business community that feared Dubois' rise. They had no interest in a real investigation that might lead to the doorsteps of their own powerful members. So, the police crafted a narrative. They ignored the evidence of a targeted assassination and instead ruled the death a drunken brawl among Negroes. It was a convenient racist trope that played on the prejudices of the day, immediately framing the crime as an internal matter within the black community, unworthy of serious attention. To lend credence to their fiction, they needed suspects. They arrested two of Dubois' own business associates, men who had worked alongside him and shared his vision. The arrests were a public spectacle, designed to close the case quickly and reinforce the official narrative. The message was clear. This was a story of black-on-black violence, a tragedy born of their own supposed inherent criminality. But the case against the two men was a sham. There was a complete and total lack of evidence connecting them to the crime. When the case finally went to court, it fell apart almost immediately, and the men were acquitted. Justice, it seemed, had a fleeting moment of triumph. But the acquittal was not the beginning of a real investigation. It was the end of the matter entirely. The New Orleans police had no intention of finding the real killers. The men who were widely known to be associates of a rival white cotton broker, the very men who had the motive and the means to eliminate Dubois, were never even questioned. Their names never appeared in a single official report. The police had successfully performed their function. They had not solved the crime, but they had controlled the narrative. They had protected the powerful, reinforced the racial hierarchy, and ensured that the murder of a successful black man would have no consequences for the white establishment. The final act of this cover-up was perhaps the most insidious. Around 1910, decades after the murder, the entire case file on the killing of Jacques Dubois mysteriously disappeared from the police archives. The official record of the crime, the sham investigation, and the names of the acquitted men, all of it vanished, leaving nothing but a ghost of an injustice. This case is a stark illustration of how police power in the 19th century South was used as an instrument of racial and economic control. The psychology of the perpetrators, the white business rivals, was one rooted in a belief in their own supremacy and their right to eliminate any threat to their economic dominance. The psychology of the police who covered for them was one of shared ideology. Their primary duty was not to the rule of law, but to the enforcement of the racial order. In their view, covering up the murder of Jacques Dubois was not a dereliction of duty, it was the fulfillment of it. This pattern of neglected violence was not new to the city. Decades earlier, in the 1840s, the notorious Gallatin Street district was a hive of criminality, a waterfront slum where robbery and murder were commonplace. The area was largely avoided by the police, a no-go zone where lawlessness reigned. This was not due to a lack of manpower, but to a deliberate policy of neglect and complicity. Some officers were directly involved in the vice trades, profiting from the very crime they were supposed to be fighting. In one documented instance from that era, a police lieutenant was dismissed from the force for a brazen attempt to cover up a murder that occurred on Gallatin Street. His dismissal highlights the official complicity, but it also reveals how rare it was for such corruption to be punished. For every officer caught, dozens more operated with impunity. From the political conspiracies of New York to the racially motivated cover-ups of New Orleans, the story of 19th century police corruption was a deeply American one. But this was not a uniquely American disease.
Across the Atlantic, in the heart of the British Empire, the forces of law and order were engaged in their own campaigns of concealment and deceit. London in the mid-19th century was the largest, wealthiest city in the world, but it was also a city of stark contrasts. The grandeur of its imperial architecture stood in the shadow of sprawling, impoverished slums. It was in one of these neighborhoods, a predominantly Irish enclave called Plumtree Court, that a stark example of police brutality and the subsequent institutional cover-up unfolded in the summer of 1851. The atmosphere in these neighborhoods was often tense. The Irish were a largely marginalized community, viewed with suspicion and prejudice by the establishment and the press. The police, often drawn from the English working class, patrolled these areas not as peacekeepers but as an occupying force. On one hot summer night, this tension boiled over into violence. A confrontation between a police officer and a young man from the community escalated. The details of the initial dispute are lost to conflicting accounts, but the result was not. The officer, in a fit of rage, beat the young man to death in the street. What followed was not an investigation, but a carefully orchestrated cover-up. The police force immediately closed ranks around their own. The official report of the incident was a work of fiction, painting the victim as a violent aggressor and the officer as a hero defending himself against a dangerous criminal. Fellow officers provided witness statements that corroborated this false narrative, creating a unified front of deception. This was the concerted effort the historical records speak of, a deliberate, coordinated campaign to conceal a murder committed by one of their own. The case eventually became a public scandal, fueled by outrage from the Irish community and a handful of crusading journalists. It led to a public inquiry and a trial, a rare instance of the police's internal workings being exposed to the light. But the very fact that it took a public outcry to force an investigation speaks volumes. The institution's first instinct was not to seek justice for the dead man, but to protect the killer within their ranks. The killing in Plumtree Court serves as a chilling reminder that the blue wall of silence is not a modern phenomenon. Its foundations were laid in the earliest days of professional policing. 4 decades later, and further north in the industrial powerhouse of Glasgow, Scotland, a different kind of cover-up took place, one that revealed the sinister alliance between industrial capital and law enforcement. This was the case of the Glasgow Docklands disappearance of 1892. The victim was a man named Angus MacLeod. He was a charismatic and fiercely outspoken union leader, a constant thorn in the side of the city's powerful shipping magnates. His primary target was Lord Archibald Blackwood, a ruthless industrialist who ran his empire with an iron fist and viewed the burgeoning labor movement as a threat to be crushed. On the night of November 5, 1892, Guy Fawkes Night, a night of smoke and celebration, Angus MacLeod vanished. He was last seen near the docks after a contentious union meeting. The Glasgow City Police were called in to investigate. The official conclusion was reached with suspicious speed. MacLeod, they declared, had likely been drinking after the meeting and, in a drunken stupor, had stumbled and fallen into the dark, cold waters of the River Clyde. It was a tragic accident, they said. Case closed. This official story was convenient for everyone, except for MacLeod's family and his union brothers, who suspected foul play. But their voices were powerless against the combined authority of the police and the city's most powerful man. For years, the official narrative held. Angus MacLeod was just another unfortunate soul claimed by the river. The truth would not surface for more than 30 years. It came in the form of a deathbed confession in 1925 from a man who had been a young police constable back in 1892. Haunted by his guilt, the dying man finally told the story of what really happened on that foggy November night.
He and his sergeant had been on patrol near the docks when they witnessed a group of men whom they recognized as enforcers in the employ of Lord Blackwood, bundling a struggling Angus MacLeod into a carriage. They had seen an abduction, plain and simple, but they did not intervene. Instead, they were met later that night by one of Blackwood's foremen. They were offered a sum of money that was, to them, a fortune, the equivalent of 5 years' salary. In exchange for this bribe, they were to do 2 things. First, they were to falsify their patrol reports, stating that the docks were quiet and that they had seen nothing unusual. Second, they were to dispose of an object found at the scene of the abduction, a heavy, blood-stained cudgel. The 2 officers agreed. They took the money, wrote the false report, and threw the murder weapon into the Clyde, the same river that would become the centerpiece of their fabricated story. Their silence bought them financial security. It cost Angus MacLeod his life and his legacy. The constable's confession exposed a conspiracy that was far more sophisticated than a simple street-level cover-up. This was a murder for hire, contracted by a powerful industrialist and concealed through the direct, paid complicity of the police. It shows law enforcement not just as a passive protector of the powerful, but as an active, paid participant in their criminal enterprises. Lord Blackwood was never held accountable. By 1925, he was long dead, a celebrated captain of industry with his name on buildings and monuments. The corrupt sergeant was also dead. The confession of the constable brought the truth to light, but it could not bring justice. The case of Angus MacLeod demonstrates in the starkest terms how a police badge and a fat wallet could be used to orchestrate a murder and then erase it from history. One of the most frustrating aspects of studying these historical cover-ups is the scarcity of reliable data. The very act of concealing a crime ensures that it is not officially recorded. We are left to piece together the truth from the margins of history, from newspaper clippings, personal diaries, and the rare, explosive findings of a public inquiry. Quantifying the exact number of crimes covered up by the police in the 19th century is an impossible task. The void of information is, in itself, a form of cover-up. The collection of crime statistics during this era was inconsistent at best and deliberately manipulated at worst. In many cities, precincts had an incentive to underreport crime to make their districts appear safer and their captains more effective. When a crime was inconvenient, either because the perpetrator was powerful or the victim was marginalized, the easiest solution was simply not to record it. What data we do have paints a grim picture of a society where a vast amount of crime went unpunished. Historians studying 19th century England and Wales, for example, acknowledge that the vast majority of crimes were never prosecuted. While not all of this can be attributed to police cover-ups, a corrupt and untrustworthy police force would have undoubtedly been a major contributing factor. Why report a crime to an officer who might be on the payroll of the person who committed it? Why risk retribution for speaking out when you have no faith that the law will protect you? This created a vicious cycle of silence. The public's distrust of the police led to underreporting, which in turn allowed the police to claim that crime rates were lower than they actually were, all while their own corruption festered in the dark. The official record became a carefully curated version of reality, scrubbed clean of the most inconvenient truths. In the United States, the data is even more speculative. The lack of centralized record-keeping and the immense power of local political machines meant that crime statistics could be easily manipulated to serve a political agenda. Historians have noted that the homicide rate in America has been on a long-term decline since colonial times. But the figures for the 19th century are largely guesswork, built on a foundation of incomplete and unreliable local records. The forgotten crimes of this era have left behind more than just historical puzzles. They have left unseen scars on the communities they affected and on the very institution of policing itself. Each cover-up eroded public trust, deepened social divisions, and reinforced the idea that justice was a privilege, not a right. The legacy of this corruption is long and complex. The systems of patronage and the blue wall of silence that were forged in the 19th century did not simply vanish with the turn of the century. They became ingrained in the culture of many police departments, creating patterns of misconduct that would persist for generations.
Understanding the historical roots of police misconduct is crucial to addressing its modern-day manifestations. The issues of police accountability, the relationship between law enforcement and marginalized communities, and the debate over the role of police in society are not new conversations. They are echoes of a struggle that began in the gaslit streets of the 19th century.
Fortunately, the pursuit of historical truth is an ongoing endeavor. The digitization of old newspapers, court records, and personal archives is providing new tools for historians and researchers to uncover these hidden stories. Cases that were once buried in dusty, forgotten files are being brought to light, giving a voice to victims who were silenced long ago. These revelations are more than just academic exercises. They are acts of historical justice. They remind us that the official record is not always the complete story, and that we must remain critical and questioning of the narratives handed down by those in power. The forgotten crimes of the 19th century serve as a powerful cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the absolute necessity of transparency and accountability in law enforcement. They remind us that a healthy society requires a police force that serves the public, not itself or its political masters. To truly grasp the depth of these cover-ups, we must look beyond the institutional factors and delve into the psychology of the individuals involved. What motivated a police officer in the 19th century to not only ignore a crime, but to actively participate in its concealment? The answers are as complex and varied as the men themselves.
For many, it was a matter of pragmatic self-enrichment. In an era of low wages and high temptation, the badge became a tool for personal gain. The psychology was not that of a public servant, but of an entrepreneur whose business was the street. Accepting a bribe to look the other way wasn't seen as a profound moral failure. It was simply a transaction, a part of the job. This mindset is evident in the Black Hand extortion plots in early 20th century New York. When the famous opera singer Enrico Caruso was targeted, his initial reports to the NYPD were ignored by precinct officers who were on the payroll of the very gangs terrorizing him. The police involved saw their role not as crime fighters, but as toll collectors on the bridge of criminal enterprise. For others, the motivation was political allegiance. In the world of Tammany Hall, loyalty to the machine was the ultimate virtue. A police captain like Big Bill Devery, a notoriously corrupt figure in turn-of-the-century New York, viewed himself as a soldier in a political army. When a vocal Irish labor organizer, Liam O'Connell, disappeared after a violent clash at a textile mill in 1886, the NYPD, under Devery's influence, officially declared him a runaway. This was despite multiple witnesses seeing him bundled into an unmarked carriage by men identified as police associates. The cover-up was motivated by a deep-seated allegiance to the factory owners, who were key supporters of Tammany Hall. The criminal psychology here reflects a belief that maintaining the socio-economic order, even through violence and deception, was a form of justice in itself, justice for the powerful. Then there was the powerful, insidious motivation of ideology, particularly racial prejudice. In cases like the Elysian Fields killing in New Orleans, the cover-up was driven by a shared belief in racial supremacy. The police officers who framed Jacques Dubois' associates and buried the investigation were not just corrupt, they were acting as enforcers of a racial hierarchy. Their psychology was rooted in the conviction that the victim, because of his race, was of a lower order, and that the white perpetrators were, by default, justified in their actions to protect their status. This twisted worldview allowed them to see the cover-up not as an obstruction of justice, but as the preservation of what they considered to be the natural order of things. Their duty was to their race first, and the law a distant second. This ideological enforcement reached its zenith in later events that followed the 19th century pattern. In the Mississippi medicine murders of the 1930s, a series of suspicious deaths among African-American sharecroppers who had attempted to unionize were systematically ruled as natural causes or accidents by the local sheriff's department. The perpetrators were landowners, and the police cover-up was driven by a shared ideology that viewed the victims as less than human and the enforcement of the racial hierarchy as their primary duty, superseding any written law. Finally, there is the psychology of the institution itself, the tribalistic instinct to protect one's own at all costs. This is the blue wall of silence we saw in the killing in Plumtree Court. The individual officer may have felt guilt or moral conflict, but the pressure to conform, to protect the brotherhood and the reputation of the force was immense. To break ranks was to become a pariah, to betray your tribe. This created a powerful psychological barrier to the truth, where loyalty to a fellow officer, even a murderer, trumped loyalty to the law. This institutional psychology often framed the outside world, particularly poor and marginalized communities, as the enemy, and any action taken against them, no matter how brutal, could be justified as necessary for maintaining control. These overlapping psychologies of greed, political loyalty, racial ideology, and institutional tribalism created a perfect storm of corruption. They allowed ordinary men to participate in extraordinary acts of injustice, often convincing themselves that they were doing the right thing, or at least the necessary thing, within the flawed system they inhabited. Unraveling these cover-ups is a form of historical detective work. It requires reading between the lines of official reports, searching for the dissenting voice in a chorus of official lies. It means understanding that the absence of a record can be as telling as the record itself. The disappearance of the Jacques Dubois case file was not a clerical error. It was the final act of the cover-up, an attempt to erase the crime from memory itself. The fight for truth in these cases did not end in the 19th century. It continues today, in the work of historians, journalists, and citizen researchers who comb through archives and digitized records. Each rediscovered fact, each re-examined case is a small victory against the forces of concealment. It is a declaration that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, still matters. These stories force us to confront a difficult reality, that the institutions we create to protect us can also be the instruments of our oppression. They challenge the simplistic, heroic narratives of history and replace them with a more complex and often more disturbing picture of the past. But in this complexity, there is also a vital lesson. The stories of these cover-ups are not just tales of corruption. They are also stories of the few who dared to speak out. The crusading journalist, the witness who refused to be silenced, the officer who, on his deathbed, finally chose his conscience over his complicity. They remind us that the fight for accountability is a perpetual one. The impulse to abuse power and conceal the truth is a constant in human history, but so is the impulse to seek justice and expose the lie. The forgotten crimes of the 19th century are a testament to the former, but the fact that we can tell their stories today is a testament to the enduring power of the latter. As we stand in the 21st century, surrounded by digital records and calls for greater transparency, it is easy to view the 19th century as a distant, almost alien world. The gas lamps have been replaced by LEDs, the horse-drawn carriages by automobiles. But the fundamental struggle between power and accountability remains as relevant as ever. The stories we have exhumed, of a man framed for murder in the Bowery, of a union leader's disappearance in Glasgow, of a businessman's assassination in New Orleans, are not mere historical footnotes. They are the foundational stones of a legacy that law enforcement still grapples with today. The deep-seated distrust between police and marginalized communities did not appear in a vacuum. It was built over generations of experiences like these, where the law was a weapon, not a shield. The culture of the blue wall of silence, the instinct to protect the institution above all else, was not invented yesterday. It was forged in cases like the killing in Plumtree Court, where the brotherhood of the badge proved stronger than the pursuit of justice for a murdered civilian. The corrupting influence of money and politics on law enforcement, so starkly illustrated by the grip of Tammany Hall, remains a persistent threat in different forms. What these forgotten crimes teach us is that history is a living entity. Its injustices do not simply fade away. They echo through time, shaping the present in ways we may not always recognize. The ghosts of Thomas Kearney, Jacques Dubois, and Angus MacLeod still haunt the archives, silent witnesses to a time when the guardians of the law were the keepers of its darkest secrets. Their stories are a powerful reminder that the official narrative is rarely the whole narrative. The truth often lies buried in the margins, and the suppressed report, the lost file, the deathbed confession. It is our duty to keep digging, to keep questioning, and to ensure that those who were intentionally forgotten are finally remembered. Because in remembering them, we do more than just correct the historical record. We reaffirm a timeless principle that no one, no matter how powerful, no matter what uniform they wear, should be above the law. The search for truth in the past is inextricably linked to the demand for justice in the present. The gas-lit streets are gone, but the shadows remain, and it is up to us to continue to shine a light into them.